I've only told my closest family this story, nobody else. My dog Gunner was my best friend. Gunner was the best dog I ever had. He was always happy and always seemed to know when I needed some cheering up. He would always come over and lay his head on my lap, and before I knew it, I was smiling again. There were so many things that I loved about Gunner. He was always so happy. Even if something bad happened, he would always wag his tail and try to make the best of it. Secondly, he was always so gentle. He never once bit or growled at anyone, even when other dogs were trying to start a fight. He was always so smart, too. He learned how to do so many tricks, and he always seemed to understand what I wanted him to do without any trouble. I could go on for hours about how great Gunner was, but I think the most important thing is that he made me happy. Whenever I was feeling down, he would come over and make me feel better. He truly was my best friend, and I miss him dearly. One night, he ran into the woods, and I spent hours trying to find him. What I saw in the woods that night shook me to the core. I will never be the same. It was such a traumatic night for me, and I'm shaking as I'm writing this to you. I had been walking for hours, calling my dog's name. He had run off into the woods earlier that day, and I was determined to find him. As the sky grew darker and darker, I began to worry. What if I never saw my best friend again? It was pitch black as I scoured the woods with my flashlight looking for Gunner. I had been calling his name relentlessly for hours, but there was no response. I brought a bag of treats with me in the hopes that he would see them and come running back to me. However, no matter how long I searched or how loudly I called him, Gunner was nowhere to be found. The forest was quiet and creepy, and every sound made my heart jump, and I constantly scanned the darkness for any sign of my furry friend. Time seemed to be standing still as I wandered through the trees, calling out Gunner's name. Finally, after hours of searching, I had to admit defeat. I went home heartbroken, not knowing if I would ever see my best friend again. The next day I returned to the woods with my parents. We scoured every inch of those woods, but still couldn't find Gunner. We put up flyers and contacted all the local animal shelters, but no one had seen him. For weeks, we searched tirelessly for my lost dog, but he was nowhere to be found. Finally, one day, out of desperation, we placed an ad on Craigslist offering a $500 reward for anyone who could find Gunner. A few nights later, we received a call from someone who had spotted him in a nearby park. We drove over there immediately, but the dog they found wasn't Gunner. Devastated, I headed back to the house and figured I would take one last look in the woods before saying goodbye to my friend. I got my flashlight, a bag of his favorite treats, and I headed out. The forest was just as eerily quiet every night I'd searched for Gunner. I screamed for him as loud as I could as I walked deeper and deeper into the woods. I continued to call his name, but there was no answer. The only sound I could hear was the crunch of leaves under my feet. I was about to finally give up when I saw some sort of creature laying on the ground. My heart sank. Was this Gunner's lifeless body on the ground? I walked slowly towards him, preparing to say my last words. My eyes filled with tears, heartbroken at what I thought was Gunner. The closer I got to the creature, the more I began to doubt it was Gunner. Was it a dead deer or something else decaying in the woods? It appeared very skinny and tall, gray in coloration. I assumed it had lost all its hair, but the closer I got, I realized it didn't have any hair at all. Was this a dead person in the middle of the woods? I started shaking as I got closer. It had pale, thin skin and looked somewhat human. As I stood directly over the body, shining the flashlight down on it, I saw that it was completely naked and almost skeletal in appearance. I felt nauseous. This thing wasn't human. Suddenly the thing turned its head, looked right at me, and started making this unnerving clicking noise. It had hollow black eyes with no nose and a giant mouth. I immediately turned around and ran as fast as I could back to the house. I have never seen anything like that in my life, and that clicking noise still haunts me. To think that thing just lurking in the woods next to my house is enough to vomit. After wondering what the hell that thing could be, I discovered some articles about a creature called the Rake. I started by reading all the accounts of people who have claimed to have seen the Rake. In doing so, I noticed that there were some patterns in the stories. Many people claimed that the Rake had hollow black eyes and was terrifying in nature. I also read accounts of people who had committed suicide after claiming to have encountered the rake. In many of these cases, the victims had left behind suicide notes in which they described the creature in great detail. Humanoid, pale skin, unnaturally skinny and tall, black hollow eyes, and no nose. I don't know for certain if what I saw was the rake, but what keeps me up at night is that my beloved dog might have been killed by that creature. That disturbs me deeply, as he deserved a long life and natural death. I miss Gunner every day, and I pray I never see that monster in the woods ever again. As I previously stated, I've never told anyone outside my immediate family this. If you've seen something similar, please comment. I know there are a lot of naysayers out there who don't believe in the paranormal, and they think that these creatures don't exist. They think that these events don't take place, but I'm here to tell you they absolutely do, without a doubt. Listening to all of the stories that are sent in makes me feel better about what I experienced. I can't go into great details on where I worked or who I worked for, but this happened in the late 90s. I held an office job for a scientific company. There were 6 of us who worked in the safety processing department. We would process paperwork and approvals for chemicals and materials that were involved with various experiments. The company had several large government contracts which were a major part of the business. It was a very secure location. We all had badges, and the entire facility had tall, barbed wire fencing with gates manned by a security guard that you had to pass through upon entering. It was a hassle to go out for lunch, so most of us would just eat in our little lunchroom. I worked with 5 other people, 3 women and 2 men. We all had similar responsibilities, but I was the manager of that department. Even as the manager, they never gave too much information away on what was going on there. We were fairly close to the testing facility. Outside of our office was this long corridor, and at the end was the entrance to the testing facility. None of us were ever authorized to go in there. It's manned by guards 24/7. Even if some of us would go out to happy hour after work, the guards never came, even after multiple invites. They never associated with us at all. Looking back, they were instructed not to interact with any of the regular employees. The only people who had access to that area were high-level executives, scientists, and the like. I remember one day we were working away, and we hear the breach siren go off. This was the first time that I heard this other than the precautionary drills we ran every 6 months. They were always scheduled, and people knew about them weeks in advance to make sure we complied with safety regulations. This one was the real thing. If something happens in the testing facility and a chemical is leaked, then the siren goes off. Really, any breach of the testing facility that is not planned, the breach sirens go off. As soon as these sirens go off, a coworker of mine, that I will call Jenny, comes running in the door from the corridor side of the office, screaming and completely out of breath. We all huddled around her and asked her what is going on. Keep in mind the siren is going off, so we need to evacuate immediately, but we pause for a second to see what Jenny is so frightened about. She's talking gibberish and is pointing to the corridor. I look at the security monitor in the corner of the office, which is a live view of the corridor, and I see this creature walking down the hallway, and I see both guards lying on the ground. At the time, it was too hard to make out if the guards were dead or not, but I assumed they were. This humanoid creature is walking very oddly, coming down the corridor right towards us. This thing looked demonic, like something straight out of hell. I can't even describe what animal it resembled, because the thing didn't have a face. It looked like it just had a huge mouth, and that was it. It had really long fingers and toes. They looked really odd. From the look I got of this thing, it looked like more than 5 fingers. It stood tall, probably 7 feet, and had these bony legs, but broad shoulders, and its arms were abnormally long. I immediately locked the door and told everyone to evacuate right now. I counted 6 of us, including me at the time, and we went out the opposite side and got to our exit point as fast as we could. There were a bunch of employees outside at that moment because the siren went off for the entire building. Everyone was asking what happened, but my office area was the only one close to the corridor. My boss immediately came over to me and my group and pulled us aside. We met with him and his boss, the director of testing, and they instructed us not to say anything to the other employees, and if something is said, we could be terminated or be held liable for leaking company information. That day, we were all told to go home, and the facility was shut down for 3 days. They blamed it on a gas leak out of the testing facility, but I know what really happened. They created something or were doing tests on something that already existed. I quit a few months after the incident, and a lot of my team did too. That place was eventually shut down around 2010. I was volunteering as a camp counselor on a really nice lake in upstate New York. I loved camp when I was a kid, so I figured it would be nice to give back. Hanging out with the youth of today and seeing what they were all about seemed like a fun way to spend my summer before going back to university. Part of working at the camp is showing up early and getting everything ready for the campers. There's a lot to get ready. You must bring in all the supplies like food and first aid stuff. There are all kinds of activity stuff, sports equipment, you name it. A lot goes into providing for hundreds of kids over a summer. It was my job to get the water activity set up. There was a lot to do. I was sort of surprised they expected me to get it all done by myself. The van was full of bags and cones and buoys and a bunch of other stuff. I dragged bags of stuff to the lake and put everything in order. It took like 10 trips. The sun was setting and dusk was settling in. It was going to be dark soon. I thought it was time to hurry up and get this done with. I was pulling out all the rope for the boundaries when I noticed something in the water. I saw splashes and ripples. I figured it was fish playing around. It was a lake after all. I ignored it and got back to work. A few minutes later, I heard a big plunk, like someone threw a rock in the lake. The ripples were bigger this time, and they spread along the surface of the water. I looked around to see if someone was messing with me. A practical joke played on the new counselor or something, but there was nobody around. The sun was behind the trees now, and it was getting colder fast. The hairs on my arms were standing up. I looked out at the water again, and it seemed almost black now. I realized the goosebumps on my arms weren't only because I was cold. I was feeling nervous being near the lake alone. I shook my head and told myself I was being ridiculous. And then I heard splashing again. I looked up, startled. I saw something going underwater. I only caught it for a second, and I wasn't sure if it was a big fish or something else. Then I saw it again, pushing its head up through the water. It sat there like an alligator. Just the top of its head was exposed. The head was long and slick, but scaly. I rubbed my eyes, literally not sure if I was hallucinating, but there it was, whatever it was. I didn't know what to do. I heard when you see a bear, you're supposed to make a bunch of noise. Or maybe you're supposed to stay quiet and back away. I couldn't remember anything. But I felt like it was a threat. The head was pointed straight at me. The head came up. First I saw the long head emerge. It was like a weird alien lizard, black and shiny and slimy. The eyes were the most horrifying part. Those shone like they had their own lights inside them. The thing rose out of the water and kept rising. It stood up on 2 legs and stared at me. It looked like the creature from the Black Lagoon, like I saw on TV when I was a kid. But the head was long and freaky like a deformed alligator. Its arms were long and thin, and on the end of each were horrifying long claws. They were shiny and yellow. It looked at me, and I swear to God I thought it was grinning. It had row after row of crooked, sharp teeth. Its right leg took one small step forward, and my body took over. I threw the ropes I was holding and ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction of the lake. I tripped and flew forward and almost knocked the wind out of myself. But I got up and kept running. I hid behind stacks of kayaks we had for the campers. I caught my breath and snuck my head around the side to look back at the water. That thing still stood there. It wasn't moving. It just stood there. I thought about yelling for help, but I was afraid the only thing that would come running was that monster in the lake. I heard sloshing in the water. I waited another minute and took one more look. I kept praying it was my imagination. But no, it was there. It looked closer to the shore now. I had to run. I turned and took off again, and headed toward the main lodge area. I hoped all the other counselors were there. While I sprinted as fast as I could, I turned over my shoulder to look back at the lake. The monster was lowering itself down. It was slow and methodical, staring at me the entire time. I kept running, and when I turned to face where I was going, I saw a counselor ahead of me waving at me. I bent down to catch my breath. The counselor asked me what I was doing. I took a deep breath and took one more look back at the lake. It was completely still and flat. There was no sign of life at all. The counselor asked me again and asked me if I was okay. I told them I was fine, that I saw something in the lake. They asked me what, and I couldn't tell them the truth. I was too afraid of sounding crazy. I just told them it was nothing, just some fish or something. They looked at me like I was a little crazy anyway. And that's why I'm sharing this story now. I need to know that there are other people who have seen something like this. I need to know I'm not alone. I'm a plumber. Been doing it for over 25 years now. The job's taken me to all sorts of weird and wonderful places, but none were as strange as this place was. A half-abandoned building nestled on the edge of a neglected part of town that was better off forgotten. It was late October. The chill of the fall air was starting to seep in. My boots crunched on the gravel as I pulled up. When I first got the call about a plumbing emergency out there, I thought it was some kind of prank. But the request came from the city office. They said the building was in use for some government stock or something. Who am I to judge? A job is a job. The looming structure cut an imposing figure against the dull gray sky. Its weathered bricks had seen better days, and the windows were boarded up, giving off an eerie vibe. The skeletal trees surrounding it didn't do much to dissuade my growing sense of unease either. It felt quiet, too quiet, like the world held its breath around this place. As I approached the entrance, the smell hit me first, an unpleasant mix of dampness and decay. Not uncommon for old buildings, but this was stronger somehow, more pervasive. A faint chirping of the crickets was the only sound cutting into the dead silence, as if nature itself was afraid to disturb this building. I found the busted pipe in the basement. The water flow had been shut off from the main, but there was a musty smell that hung in the air, an undercurrent of something acrid, almost sulfuric. It was different. It was off. The pipe looked gnashed, covered in scrapes and dents. I figured the building's age was causing the infrastructure to crumble, but something about it didn't seem right. It almost looked like bite marks. I shrugged off the thought, reasoning it was probably some vermin or a raccoon. The basement was in dire need of a cleanup job. Among the dust-cobwebbed corners and scattered debris, I noticed a pile of old furniture shrouded in a thick, moth-eaten cloth. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and despite myself, I felt a chill run down my spine. Kneeling down by the damaged pipe, my flashlight began to flicker. I remember thinking, just my luck. The silence was deafening around me, interrupted only by the low hum of my tools and the sporadic flickering light painting grotesque shadows all around. Suddenly, the temperature seemed to drop drastically. A chill swept through the room like an all-consuming fog, the sort of chill that sinks deep into your bones. That's when I heard it, a low guttural growl echoing from the unseen corners of the basement. It was distant, barely audible, but it was there. A rumbling growl, like that of a dog but deeper, resonating within that cold, quiet basement. But those were thoughts for later. I shrugged both the cold and the growl, attributing it to the wind howling outside. After all, I had a pipe to fix. No sooner had I pushed these unsettling thoughts aside than I heard it again, this time louder, more menacing. A low growling sound that seemed to vibrate through the emptiness. I shook it off once more, but I felt my mind pull itself back to those strange dents on the pipe. The thought of a raccoon making those marks somehow seemed less plausible. I heard the odd sound once more, louder and much clearer than before. It was unmistakably a growl, guttural and menacing. A primal fear began to seep into my veins. That's when I noticed, amongst the rat-infested pile and dust-covered debris, movement, slow but deliberate. An ominous shadow was all I saw, hunched and lurking. Just the sight of the shadow struck me cold. It was huge, easily 7 to 9 feet, and it was not human. Right then, every fiber of my being screamed to bolt, to get away from this place as fast as possible. There, standing in that basement with the damaged pipe and the low growling that hung in the silence, I felt a fear I hadn't felt since childhood. The mysterious creature, the ruined pipe, those growls, it all made a horrific sense. Collecting my nerves, I started to pack up my tools. My mind was ordering my hands to work faster, but icy terror made them sluggish, clumsy. The growling was getting louder and closer. As I finally picked up my tool bag, my flashlight flared back to life, and for a moment, it illuminated the beast behind the growl. I would never forget what I saw. A creature with the look of a hyena, a face that was nothing short of demonic. It had a snarling mouth filled with double rows of razor-sharp fangs and large pointy ears. Its body, hunched on human-like legs, was covered in dark fur. Its chest, wide and powerful, spoke of unnerving strength. I saw the eyes just as my flashlight flickered and died again, intelligent and cold, with an unworldly intensity. In what felt like a purely instinctive response, I turned and fled, leaving all my tools behind. The growls seemed to follow me as I sprinted up the stairs, echoing through the building. I couldn't look back. I threw myself into my van, hit the gas, and got the hell out of there. Months have gone by since that chilling encounter, but its memory is as fresh as if it happened yesterday. I can still feel the cold dread when I remember that night, in the basement with that thing. The damp, musty smell, sulfuric, almost like wet dog mixed with rotting meat. The chilling echo of that growl, and the way it looked at me. Every time I pass by an old forgotten building, I feel an involuntary shudder. An intense sense of wariness washes over me. City officials dismissed my claims, saying wild animals were normal for abandoned structures. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But one thing's for sure, not a single person has been able to explain the strange destruction of that pipe. Now, I can't help but wonder what else might be lurking out there, in the shadowy corners of forgotten places, living, existing amongst us. The thought shakes me with a startling realization. Sometimes, the most disturbing things hide where no one thinks to look, just like that half-abandoned building. I have a story from my time as a state police officer in northwestern Montana. There were a few odd situations over the years, but nothing compares to this. I was sent out to a rural homestead to investigate a complaint of property damage and potential theft. The homestead was an off-grid cabin about as deep in the mountains as you could get, while still having access to a halfway decent road in the winter to make it to and from town. The couple that lived there were odd, to say the least. They were mostly self-sustainable out there. They raised a few farm animals and grew a lot of their own food and stored it over the winter in a root cellar. It was nearing the end of fall, and most of the mountain roads were closed for the winter. The drive up to the cabin was a little hairy, but I made it okay. When I arrived, the only thing I knew was that something happened involving the root cellar, but I waited for them to tell me their story. And it was quite the story at that. It began last summer. They noticed food going missing from their garden. They figured it was the local wildlife and installed a fence around the garden. But food continued to disappear. The garden was done for the season, but I checked the fence. It was 8 feet tall and there were no signs of animals getting through or under the fence. The only way into the garden was through a gate, and the couple both said they never once found the gate unlatched. They installed a mess cover on top of the fence to prevent any birds or animals that could climb the fence. There was truly nowhere that an animal could get through this fence. Now, wildlife eating through people's gardens is definitely a problem out here, but it wasn't something you'd call the police for. After harvesting the garden and moving everything into the root cellar, someone or something began breaking in and stealing food from there. And here is where it gets weird. There were no signs of any animals, no prints, no scat. The door to the root cellar was not damaged in any way, but there was a significant number of things missing. They told me that pretty much everything in there was stored in various sizes of mason jars. All the jars were missing. Nothing was knocked on the ground, just vanished. If the food thief was an animal of some sort, we'd expect to see jars on the ground and things damaged or broken in the cellar, but there was none of that. The man just looked at me. I could tell he wanted to speak, but something stopped him. I told him to go ahead, that I've probably heard stranger theories. He told me he had been watching the root cellar through the window every night for the past 2 weeks, and he finally saw the culprit. He said it was a human, but it wasn't a normal human. He didn't know whether to call the police or Fish and Wildlife. I asked him to elaborate, and he said he saw the thief heading to the cellar just after dark, and it was definitely a person. The lack of outside lights made it difficult to see, but he went outside to confront the suspected food thief and scare him off. He met him coming out of the cellar carrying a leather bag full of mason jars. The man said he was human, but he wasn't human like we were. He had a large brow ridge and deep-set eyes. His face and body were square-shaped, and he was only maybe 5 feet tall. He was wearing boots and clothes that appeared to be made from fur and animal hide. The man said it was like looking at some prehistoric history book. He yelled at the thief, and it took off running towards the forest, but before it did, it reached into its bag and tried to hand the man something. He didn't take it, but a person or creature or whatever dropped it on the ground and ran. He followed the thief to the edge of the forest, but it was too dark to try to track whatever it was. He went back to inspect the root cellar and see what all had been taken. It was at that moment that he looked on the ground for what the creature tried to offer him. There were arrowheads, spear points, and a couple of other stone tools. I had absolutely no idea what to do about this case. I took the arrowheads for evidence, but I didn't have anything else to go on. We couldn't find a trail in the forest to even attempt to track the creature. I was straight with the couple. I told them there wasn't much I could do here. They asked if anyone else in the area had seen these people. The man was convinced that there are. I don't know how to say it without sounding crazy, but cave people living out in the mountains, completely isolated from the rest of society. He said he wasn't sure if they were a separate species of human or not, but that they could be the cause for all the Bigfoot stories in the area. I can't say if I believed him or not. I never saw the creature. I did, however, follow up with the couple in the spring of the year. They were both out working in the garden when I arrived and had expanded it quite a bit, and strangely, they said they weren't having any problems anymore. On my way back to my vehicle, I glanced at the root cellar. The door had a display of arrowheads along the top that wasn't there last fall. I didn't ask any more questions. Looking back, I wished I had, but at the same time, I don't think I was ready to know what exactly lives out there in the mountains.